They say revenge is a dish best served cold. In my case, it was served with precisely 837 gallons of meticulously collected rainwater and a lifetime's worth of regulatory knowledge that would drown the self-importance right out of Lakeside, a state's most tyrannical HOA president. When Patricia Holloway condemned my home and threatened to have my family removed over our unsightly and dangerous water conservation system, she had no idea she was declaring war on the very person who wrote the state's rainwater harvesting guidelines. How does one calculate the exact moment when justice crystallizes from patience? Welcome to my channel. Please subscribe if you want more Karen and HOA stories. I never considered myself someone who would find satisfaction in another person's downfall. Before all this started, I was just another homeowner in Lakeside Estates, tucked away in the sun-scorched suburbs of southern Arizona, where our community's lush green lawns and decorative fountains stood in defiant contradiction to the cracked earth and water rationing notices that had become fixtures of our region's fourth consecutive year of extreme drought. My wife Laura and I purchased our modest Spanish-style home 5 years ago, drawn to the terracotta roof tiles and the spacious backyard, where I envisioned creating a drought-resistant garden that would honor my grandmother's legacy. Abuela Elena had been a master of desert gardening, teaching me from childhood how to coax life from parched soil using traditional water conservation techniques passed down through generations of our family who had farmed in the region long before it became suburbia. I spent my weekdays in a nondescript government building downtown, my office door bearing a simple plaque, Daniel Ortiz, Director, Regional Water Conservation District. My job involved endless meetings with municipal leaders, agricultural representatives, and corporate interests, all vying for their share of our increasingly limited water resources. The drought had transformed my once bureaucratic position into something far more critical, as I found myself drafting emergency conservation measures and testifying before state legislators about the need for innovative approaches to our water crisis. At home, however, I was simply Dan, the guy who waved to his neighbors during morning runs, who helped Mrs. Castillo carry in her groceries, who attended HOA meetings dutifully if not enthusiastically. Laura and I had agreed early on that keeping my professional position separate from our neighborhood identity made sense. Water policy was contentious enough without bringing those conflicts home, and truthfully, I enjoyed the anonymity of just being another homeowner rather than the water guy, who everyone approached with complaints about their bills or requests for special exceptions. Our life had a comfortable rhythm to it, balancing the increasing pressures of my work with the simple pleasures of home. Each evening, I'd spend time tending to my small but thriving garden of native plants, carefully designed to minimize water usage while providing bursts of vibrant color throughout the year. The saguaro cactus that stood sentinel at the corner of our property was over 100 years old, predating not just our subdivision but likely the city itself. I felt a particular connection to this ancient survivor, admiring its resilience through countless droughts more severe than the one we currently faced. Little did I know that this peaceful existence was about to be disrupted by a perfect storm of climate crisis, bureaucratic overreach, and one woman's pathological need for control. I first met Patricia Holloway 3 months after she was elected HOA president in a special vote following the previous president's sudden resignation. The community newsletter heralded her arrival with an overly enthusiastic profile piece, complete with a professional headshot that showed off her meticulously highlighted blonde bob and practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. The article emphasized her background in luxury property management and her commitment to enhancing community standards and property values. It was at the July HOA meeting that I truly understood what those euphemisms meant. Patricia arrived 15 minutes late, creating a deliberate stir as she entered the community center meeting room, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She wore a cream-colored linen pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, accented with gold jewelry that caught the fluorescent lights as she gestured emphatically. The large Louis Vuitton tote she carried contained not just her executive portfolio, but also what I would come to recognize as her weapons of choice: a digital camera, measuring tape, and a dog-eared copy of the community bylaws, flagged with dozens of neon sticky notes. "Good evening, neighbors," she began, her voice carrying a saccharine quality that felt rehearsed. "I'm so thrilled to be leading our beautiful Lakeside Estates toward the future it deserves, As I'm sure you've all noticed, some areas of our community have begun to, let's say, drift from the standards that attracted all of us to invest here. She proceeded to conduct a 20-minute slideshow of what she termed areas of concern, a collection of photographs documenting minor infractions throughout the neighborhood. Mrs. Rivera's wind chimes that apparently exceeded the allowable size by 2 inches. The Johnsons' basketball hoop that was the wrong shade of beige. The Patel family's garbage bins that were visible from the street for apparently 17 minutes after collection day had ended. These may seem like small issues, Patricia continued, clicking through to an image of a child's bicycle left overnight on a front porch. But small issues become big issues, and big issues become declining property values. I glanced around the room, noting the mixture of expressions, some neighbors nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. A few like myself trying to maintain neutral expressions while internally questioning what alternate reality we had stumbled into where children's bicycles constituted a community crisis. When the meeting ended, Patricia stationed herself by the door, clipboard in hand, stopping residents to schedule compliance consultations for properties she had identified as problematic. I managed to slip past with just a smile and nod, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me as I walked home under the vast desert sky, stars dimmed by the community's excessive landscape lighting that Patricia had praised as proper illumination standards. "She's going to be trouble," Laura said later that night as we sat on our back patio, the day's heat finally dissipating into the cool evening air. "Did you see how she cornered the Garcias about their xeriscape plans, acting like native plants are somehow offensive to look at while we're literally running out of water? The bylaws do specify maintained grass areas in front yards," I admitted reluctantly. "It's an outdated requirement but technically enforceable." Laura gave me a knowing look. "And I suppose you're not going to mention that your office just released guidelines recommending precisely the type of landscaping the Garcias are trying to install." I sighed, taking a long sip of my iced tea. "You know why I keep work separate from the neighborhood. Water politics are complicated enough without everyone knowing they're living next to the guy who could actually help them navigate these issues," she challenged. "The guy who literally helped write the state laws about residential water rights." I had no good answer for her then. In retrospect, my silence was the first in a series of missed opportunities that would eventually force my hand in ways I never anticipated. The first direct conflict with Patricia came in late August, when Arizona's brutal summer reached its peak intensity. The governor had just declared a Stage 3 water emergency, implementing mandatory restrictions across the state. At my office, we were working 14-hour days coordinating emergency response, meeting with affected communities, and trying to secure additional resources from neighboring states. It was during this chaotic period that I finally found time to implement a project I'd been researching for months, a comprehensive rainwater harvesting system for our home. The design was elegant and efficient, a network of gutters and downspouts connected to an underground collection tank, complemented by smaller decorative barrels strategically placed to capture additional runoff. The system would allow us to collect, filter, and reuse rainwater for our garden and outdoor needs, potentially reducing our household water consumption by nearly 40%. I submitted the proper permits to the city, received approval within days, expedited due to the emergency declarations, and scheduled installation for the following week. As an afterthought, I dropped a copy of the plans into the HOA's submission box, though technically such systems had been explicitly permitted under state law since the legislation I had helped draft 3 years earlier. The installation took 2 days and was completed without incident. The main collection tank was buried beneath our side yard, invisible except for a small access panel disguised as a decorative rock. The 4 auxiliary collection barrels were painted in muted earth tones that complemented our home's exterior. The entire system was a model of the guidelines my office had been promoting: efficient, aesthetically integrated, and critically important given the escalating water crisis. 3 days later, I returned home from work to find a hot pink violation notice taped to our front door. "Notice of unapproved external modification," the header read in bold capital letters. Below, in Patricia's precise handwriting, "Unauthorized water collection devices installed without HOA approval. Potential health hazard, mosquito breeding concern, and visual violation of community standards." Removal required within 72 hours or daily fines of $100 will be assessed. I stood in my driveway, notice in hand, feeling a slow burn of indignation rising through my chest. The irony was almost too perfect, being cited for a water conservation system in the midst of the worst drought in state history, by an HOA president whose own extravagant lawn sprinklers I could hear hissing in the background, running despite the odd-day watering restrictions currently in place. Taking a deep breath, I decided to handle this reasonably. I would speak with Patricia directly, explain the system's importance, its compliance with state law, and perhaps even offer to conduct an educational session for interested neighbors on water conservation techniques. I called the number listed on the HOA contact sheet that evening. "Holloway residence," Patricia answered, her voice carrying that same artificial pleasantness I recognized from meetings. "Hello, Patricia. This is Daniel Ortiz from Saguaro Lane. I received a violation notice about my rainwater harvesting system, and I wanted to discuss it with you." There was a brief pause. "Ah, yes, the contraptions in your yard. The board has serious concerns about standing water and the visual impact on our community aesthetic." "They're not contraptions," I explained calmly. "It's a professionally installed rainwater harvesting system, fully permitted by the city and explicitly protected under state law ARS 15853, which prevents HOAs from prohibiting water conservation measures during declared drought emergencies." Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Ortiz, I'm not sure where you're getting your information, but our bylaws clearly state that all external modifications require prior HOA approval, which you failed to obtain." "I submitted the plans last week," I countered. "And regardless, state law supersedes HOA bylaws when it comes to water conservation measures during an emergency declaration." "Well," her voice took on a distinctly cooler tone, "I'm not a lawyer, Mr. Ortiz, but I do know that our community has standards. Those barrels are an eyesore, and the board has concerns about mosquito breeding and potential water contamination that could affect neighboring properties." I pinched the bridge of my nose, fighting for patience. "The system is completely sealed and filtered. There's no standing water exposed to the air, which means no mosquito breeding possibility. As for aesthetics, the visible components were specifically designed to blend with the environment, and—" "The violation stands," she interrupted. "You have 72 hours to remove the system or the fines will begin. If you wish to appeal, you can submit a request in writing to be considered at next month's board meeting." Next month's meeting would be nearly 4 weeks away, 4 weeks of daily $100 fines. The calculation was obvious and intentional. "Patricia," I tried once more, "we're in the middle of an unprecedented water crisis. The governor has declared a state emergency. Surely the HOA can see the importance of—" "Rules are rules, Mr. Ortiz. They apply to everyone equally. I suggest you focus your energy on compliance rather than excuses. Have a pleasant evening." The line went dead before I could respond. Laura found me still standing in the kitchen, phone in hand, staring out the window toward Patricia's house with its lush green lawn and decorative fountain that ran 24 hours a day. "That bad?" she asked, though she clearly knew the answer. "She's unbelievable," I muttered, completely disconnected from reality. Laura placed a hand on my shoulder. "Maybe it's time to mention what you do for a living." I shook my head. "Not yet. Let me try handling this through the proper channels first." That night, I drafted a formal appeal letter, citing relevant state statutes, including copies of our approved city permits, and attaching the water conservation guidelines my office had published. I hand-delivered it to Patricia's mailbox the next morning, along with a USB drive containing educational materials about the benefits of rainwater harvesting systems during drought conditions. 2 days later, I received another notice, this one informing me that my appeal had been expedited and unanimously rejected by the board's executive committee. The final line stated, "Removal of unauthorized water collection system required immediately. Inspection scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. Patricia didn't come alone for the inspection. She arrived with 2 other board members in tow, a nervous-looking man named Richard who avoided eye contact, and a thin woman named Barbara who seemed to exist solely to nod in agreement with Patricia's every statement. They marched up my driveway like a small invading army, Patricia leading with her clipboard and digital camera at the ready. Mr. Ortiz, she greeted me with a tight smile that resembled a grimace. We're here to verify compliance with the violation notice. As I explained in my appeal, I began, the system is fully compliant with state law, which specifically prevents HOAs from prohibiting water conservation measures during. Yes, yes, she waved her hand dismissively. We've reviewed your opinions on the matter. The board's decision stands. She proceeded to walk the perimeter of my property, photographing each collection barrel from multiple angles, making disapproving sounds as she scribbled notes on her clipboard. Richard and Barbara trailed behind her like reluctant shadows. Patricia, I tried again, following the procession around my home, we're literally in Stage 3 water restrictions. The governor has asked all residents to reduce consumption by at least 30%. This system helps accomplish that goal while maintaining the garden. She paused, turning to face me with an expression of practiced concern. Mr. Ortiz, while we all appreciate conservation efforts, there are appropriate ways to contribute that don't involve installing unsightly industrial equipment in a residential neighborhood. Industrial equipment? I echoed in disbelief, gesturing toward the terracotta-colored collection barrel that matched our roof tiles perfectly. This was specifically designed to blend with the aesthetic of our home. Patricia's smile tightened further. The board disagrees. Additionally, we have concerns about potential mosquito breeding and standing water creating health hazards for the community. As I've already explained, the system is completely sealed. Furthermore, she continued as if I hadn't spoken, there are concerns about water runoff potentially affecting neighboring properties' foundations. This was becoming absurd. The system literally prevents runoff by capturing it. Patricia turned to her companions. Richard, Barbara, do you have any additional concerns to note? Richard studied his shoes intently, while Barbara quickly added, it's very industrial looking. I took a deep breath, trying a different approach. Would it help if I provided documentation from experts about the safety and benefits of these systems, or perhaps a modification to the visible components to better match the neighborhood aesthetic? Patricia's expression shifted subtly, a momentary flash of annoyance breaking through her professional veneer. Mr. Ortiz, the decision has been made. Your continued resistance is only making this more difficult for everyone involved. She handed me another paper from her clipboard, a revised violation notice with updated language. The fine schedule begins today. Additionally, the board has determined that unauthorized water collection systems constitute a significant modification under Bylaw Section 8.3, which carries a base penalty of $500 in addition to the daily fines. I skimmed the notice, my frustration mounting. This is unreasonable, Patricia. I'm exercising my legal right to conserve water during a state-declared emergency. If you believe we're acting improperly, you're welcome to pursue legal remedies, she replied smoothly. Until then, the fines stand. Good day, Mr. Ortiz. As they walked away, I heard Barbara whisper, do you think he'll actually pay those fines? Patricia's response drifted back to me on the hot desert air. They always pay eventually, or they leave. Either way, problem solved. What followed was a methodical campaign of harassment that seemed to consume Patricia's every waking moment. Daily, inspection visits, often while I was at work, leaving Laura to deal with the hostility. Additional violation notices for increasingly trivial matters, our native plant garden suddenly deemed unkempt. The shade of our front door questioned as possibly unapproved. The ancient saguaro cactus labeled a safety hazard. Each evening, I would return home to find new pink notices plastered to our door, each more absurd than the last. The financial impact was starting to become concerning, with fines now totaling over $2,000 and increasing daily. Other neighbors began receiving similar treatment, particularly those who had expressed support for our situation. The Garcias found themselves cited for their xeriscaped yard that had been in place for 3 years without issue. Mrs. Castillo, a widowed retired teacher, received violations for her modest vegetable garden that apparently constituted agricultural use in a residential zone. It's like she's declaring war on the entire concept of water conservation, Laura said one evening as we sat surrounded by the growing collection of violation notices spread across our dining table. Does she not understand we're in a drought? Oh, she understands, I replied, sorting through the latest batch of citations. She just doesn't care. It's about control, not reason. Laura looked at me intently. Dan, this has gone beyond ridiculous. You need to use your position, one call to the state regulatory board and— And what? I interrupted, more sharply than I'd intended. Force her to back down through my professional connections? That's not how I want to operate, Laura. There has to be a proper way to resolve this. While we're searching for this proper way, we're hemorrhaging money in fines and our neighbors are being terrorized, Laura countered. At what point does principle become stubbornness? I had no good answer. Instead, I focused on documenting everything, filing formal appeals, and researching our legal options. I even reached out to several of my colleagues at the State Water Resources Department for advice, careful to present the situation as a hypothetical scenario rather than my personal predicament. Meanwhile, Patricia's crusade intensified. Security cameras appeared on her property, conspicuously aimed at our home. She began hosting community standards meetings where our property was presented as an example of declining conditions that threaten neighborhood values. Several neighbors reported being questioned about our activities, our visitors, even the times we came and went from our home. The breaking point came in early October, nearly 2 months into the conflict. I returned home from an especially grueling day at the office. We had just implemented emergency water rationing for 3 counties, to find not the usual pink violation notice, but an official-looking document printed on legal paper. Notice of condemnation proceedings, the header read. Below, in coldly professional language, the document stated that the Lakeside Estates HOA board had voted unanimously to initiate condemnation procedures against our property on the grounds that our unauthorized water collection system constitutes an immediate health hazard to the community. The notice further stated that we had 30 days to remediate all violations, or the HOA would petition the county to have our home declared uninhabitable, potentially forcing us to vacate the premises. Laura found me standing in the driveway, the paper trembling slightly in my hands as I struggled to process the sheer audacity of the threat. "What is it?" she asked, concern etching her features as she took in my expression. Wordlessly, I handed her the notice. She read it quickly, her face transitioning from concern to disbelief to rage. "This is insane," she finally managed. "They can't possibly have the authority to condemn our home over a rainwater system, can they?" "No," I said definitively. "They absolutely cannot. This is intimidation, pure and simple." I took the paper back, folding it carefully and placing it in my briefcase. "But they've finally crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." Laura studied my face. "What are you going to do?" For the first time since the conflict began, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The clarity of purpose that comes when a decision that has been brewing for weeks finally crystallizes into certainty. "What I should have done from the beginning," I replied. "Stop pretending this is a reasonable disagreement between neighbors and recognize it for what it is, an abuse of power that needs to be confronted directly." That night, I made a series of phone calls to colleagues at the State Water Resources Board, to contacts in the County Environmental Health Department, to a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes who happened to be a college friend, and finally to a local journalist who had recently interviewed me about the drought emergency. By morning, I had a comprehensive plan in place. It was time to reveal exactly who Patricia Holloway had chosen to target with her petty tyranny. I spent the next 3 weeks meticulously gathering information, not just about our situation, but about Patricia's broader pattern of selective enforcement and potential conflicts of interest. What emerged was far more troubling than I had initially suspected. Through public records requests, I discovered that Patricia had recently become a community relations consultant for Desert Pure Bottling Company, a controversial water bottling operation that had been fighting my department's conservation regulations for years. The company had been lobbying aggressively against residential water collection systems, arguing they constituted private appropriation of shared resources, a talking point Patricia had begun parroting in HOA newsletters. Further digging revealed that several of the HOA board members who had rubber-stamped Patricia's decisions had financial ties to real estate development companies, currently seeking exemptions from the new water restriction regulations my office had implemented. Most disturbing of all, I uncovered evidence that Patricia had been selectively enforcing water usage restrictions throughout the community, ignoring excessive consumption by board members and their allies, while aggressively targeting households that had installed conservation measures. I compiled everything into a comprehensive dossier, complete with documentation, photographs, and testimony from affected neighbors who had finally found the courage to speak up once they understood they weren't alone in being targeted. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for November 15th. According to the agenda Patricia had distributed, a significant portion would be dedicated to enforcement actions against non-compliant properties, with our address specifically listed for discussion. "Are you ready for this?" Laura asked as we prepared to leave for the meeting, her hand warm and reassuring in mine. I nodded, checking one last time that I had all the necessary materials in my briefcase. More than ready. It's time Patricia learned there are consequences to abusing power. The community center was unusually crowded that evening. Word had spread that something significant might happen, drawing residents who normally avoided these contentious gatherings. Patricia sat at the center of the board table on the small raised platform at the front of the room, flanked by Richard, Barbara, and two other board members. She looked particularly pleased with herself, arranging papers with an air of self-importance as neighbors filed in. I chose a seat in the front row, directly in her line of sight, meeting her gaze steadily when she glanced up and registered my presence. Something in my expression must have given her pause. A momentary flicker of uncertainty crossed her features before she composed herself and called the meeting to order. The first 40 minutes proceeded according to the standard agenda: approval of previous minutes, treasurer's report, landscape committee updates. Throughout it all, Patricia maintained her facade of professional authority, though I noticed she kept glancing my way, perhaps unsettled by the calm confidence I was projecting. Finally, she reached the item I had been waiting for. "Next on our agenda, enforcement actions against non-compliant properties," she announced, shuffling her papers importantly. "As many of you know, the board has been working diligently to maintain our community standards despite some resistance from certain homeowners." She clicked her presentation remote, and a photograph of my home appeared on the projection screen, zoomed in specifically on one of the rainwater collection barrels. "The property at 1742 Saguaro Lane has been an ongoing violation of multiple community standards for over 2 months now," she continued. "Despite numerous notices, fines totaling $4,750, and direct communications from the board, the owners have refused to remove the unauthorized water collection system that poses potential health and safety risks to surrounding properties." She clicked to another slide, a copy of the condemnation notice. "As a result, the board has initiated condemnation proceedings under Section 12.4 of our bylaws. We have prepared a petition to the county to have the property declared a public nuisance and potentially uninhabitable if remediation is not completed immediately." Murmurs spread through the room. Several neighbors looked at me with expressions ranging from sympathy to confusion. "Before we proceed to a formal vote on this matter," Patricia continued, "the board will allow the homeowner 5 minutes to address the violation, should he wish to do so." She looked directly at me, her expression one of practiced sympathy that couldn't quite mask the satisfaction underneath. "Mr. Ortiz, would you like to make a statement?" "I would, thank you," I replied, rising from my seat and walking calmly to the podium she had indicated. I placed my briefcase on the small table beside me, opening it deliberately as I began to speak. "Good evening, neighbors. For those who don't know me well, my name is Daniel Ortiz. My wife Laura and I have lived in Lakeside Estates for 5 years now. We've always believed in being good neighbors and responsible community members." I removed a folder from my briefcase, placing it on the podium. "When I installed a rainwater harvesting system on our property 3 months ago, it was in direct response to the continuing drought emergency that affects all of us. The system was professionally designed, properly permitted, and installed in accordance with all relevant regulations." Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly waiting for me to finish so she could dismiss my concerns as she had done repeatedly. "Ms. Holloway and the board have characterized this water conservation system as unauthorized, unsightly, and a health hazard. They've issued thousands of dollars in fines and have now taken the extraordinary step of attempting to condemn our home." I paused, making eye contact with several neighbors before continuing. What Ms. Holloway failed to mention in her presentation is that residential rainwater harvesting systems are explicitly protected under Arizona state law, specifically Senate Bill 1522, passed 3 years ago, which prevents HOAs from prohibiting water conservation measures during declared drought emergencies, exactly the situation we currently face. Patricia leaned forward, interjecting, "Mr. Ortiz, as we've explained repeatedly, the HOA bylaws require prior approval for all external modifications, which you failed to obtain." I nodded, as if considering her point. "That's an interesting legal interpretation, Ms. Holloway. Perhaps we should clarify exactly how state law interfaces with HOA bylaws in this situation." I removed a business card from my pocket and placed it on the document camera, projecting it onto the screen behind me. The card displayed the state seal along with my name and title: Daniel Ortiz, Director, Regional Water Conservation District. A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the audience as Patricia's expression froze, her mouth slightly open in shock. "For those unfamiliar with my professional role," I continued, my voice steady, "I oversee water conservation programs for our entire region. My office drafts the water usage guidelines that all communities, including lakeside estates, are legally required to follow during drought emergencies." Patricia's face had drained of color, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. "In fact," I added, removing another document from my folder, "I personally helped draft Senate Bill 1522, the very law that Ms. Holloway has been repeatedly violating through her enforcement actions against not just my family, but several other homeowners who have installed water conservation measures." The room had gone completely silent now, all eyes moving between Patricia's increasingly panicked expression and my calm demeanor. "What you may find particularly interesting," I continued, "is that while Ms. Holloway has been zealously pursuing homeowners for conservation efforts, she has simultaneously been working as a paid consultant for Desert Pure Bottling Company, a corporation currently lobbying against residential water rights in our state legislature." I placed another document on the camera, a copy of Patricia's consulting contract with Desert Pure, highlighted sections showing her compensation structure and responsibilities in community relations regarding water usage regulations. The gasp from the audience was audible. Patricia half rose from her seat, her composure finally cracking. "That's completely, you can't just, this is private information." "Actually, Ms. Holloway, it's public record," I corrected her gently. "Desert Pure is required to disclose all consultant relationships in their quarterly lobbying reports. Your contract has been on file with the Secretary of State's office since August, coincidentally, the same month you began your campaign against water conservation systems in our neighborhood." Barbara was whispering urgently to Patricia, who had sunk back into her chair, her face now flushed with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. "Let me be absolutely clear," I said, addressing the room more broadly now. "The actions taken by Ms. Holloway and this board are not just unreasonable, they are illegal under state law. The condemnation notice issued against my property has no legal basis whatsoever and constitutes an actionable case of harassment." I placed my final document on the camera, a formal cease and desist letter from the State Attorney General's office, addressed to the Lakeside Estates HOA. "This notice from the Attorney General, delivered to the board this morning, orders an immediate halt to all enforcement actions against water conservation measures in our community. Additionally, it requires the board to rescind all fines issued in violation of Senate Bill 1522, and to provide my office with complete records of all board decisions regarding water usage and conservation for the past 12 months. The community center erupted in a mixture of applause, exclamations, and confused questions. Several neighbors stood, pointing accusatory fingers toward Patricia, who appeared to be having an intense whispered argument with Richard and Barbara. I held up my hands, waiting for the noise to subside. "I want to emphasize that my goal here is not to create division in our community. We are all facing an unprecedented water crisis that requires cooperation and shared sacrifice. My hope is that, moving forward, our HOA can work constructively with homeowners to implement sensible conservation measures that protect both our environment and our property values." I turned directly to Patricia, who was now staring at me with undisguised loathing. Ms. Holloway, in light of the legal notice from the Attorney General and the clear conflict of interest revealed by your consulting relationship with Desert Pure, I believe the appropriate next step would be your immediate resignation from the board. The room erupted again, this time with calls of agreement and demands for accountability. Patricia attempted to restore order by pounding her gavel, but the community's patience had clearly run out. From the back of the room, Mrs. Castillo's voice rose above the din. I move to vote for Patricia's removal, effective immediately. I second that motion, called Mr. Garcia, standing to make himself heard. Patricia's face contorted with fury. You can't just, this isn't, we have procedures. Yes, we do, confirmed Richard unexpectedly, sliding away from Patricia slightly. According to the bylaws, any board member can be removed by a 2/3 vote of homeowners present at a properly noticed meeting. This item isn't on the agenda, Patricia protested, desperation evident in her voice. Actually, I interjected, pointing to her own presentation still visible on the screen, you placed enforcement actions against non-compliant properties on the agenda. The Attorney General's cease and desist order and your conflict of interest are directly relevant to that item. What followed was the most cathartic 30 minutes of community governance I had ever witnessed. An immediate vote was held, with Patricia's removal approved by all but 3 homeowners. A temporary replacement board was elected from volunteers, with explicit instructions to work with my office on implementing water conservation guidelines throughout the community. As the meeting concluded, neighbors surrounded me with questions, expressions of support, and apologies for not standing up sooner. Through the crowd, I caught a glimpse of Patricia gathering her belongings, her face a mask of humiliation and rage. Our eyes met briefly across the room, hers burning with hatred, mine steady with the calm certainty of justice finally served. The transformation of Lakeside Estates over the following months was remarkable. Under the guidance of the new board, the community became a model for water conservation in residential developments. Xeriscaping replaced water-intensive lawns, rainwater harvesting systems were installed in common areas, and our community center began hosting monthly workshops on sustainable desert living. Patricia Holloway listed her home for sale 3 weeks after the meeting. The "For Sale" sign appeared overnight, and she was rarely seen outside afterward. Rumors circulated that Desert Pure had terminated her consulting contract following the public revelation of her conflict of interest and the resulting negative publicity. The local newspaper ran a detailed investigative piece titled Drought Profiteers: How Corporate Interests Infiltrate Community Governance, that featured her actions prominently. 2 months later, a moving truck appeared, and Patricia departed Lakeside Estates without saying goodbye to anyone. Her property sold well below market value, perhaps due to a detailed disclosure statement now required by the HOA regarding water usage histories for all properties, a policy I had quietly suggested to the new board. As for our rainwater harvesting system, it became something of a local attraction. Neighbors regularly stopped by to learn how it worked, and several implemented similar designs for their own homes. During a rare winter downpour, our system collected enough water to sustain our garden through 3 months of spring, a small victory against the ongoing drought that filled me with disproportionate satisfaction. Laura likes to tease me about how long I resisted using my position to address the situation. You and your principles, she'll say, rolling her eyes affectionately. Sometimes the most ethical choice is to use the power you have. She's right, of course. There's a distinct difference between wielding authority for personal gain and using it to protect not just yourself but an entire community against exploitation. The line between patience and passivity can be thinner than we like to admit. Sometimes at night, I still replay those moments in the community center, the gradual shift in the room as understanding dawned, the collapse of Patricia's carefully constructed facade of authority, the collective awakening of my neighbors to the manipulation they had endured. There's a particular quality to justified vindication that feels almost transcendent, a crystalline clarity that cuts through months of accumulated frustration. What stays with me most, however, isn't the satisfaction of Patricia's downfall, but the profound reminder of how fragile our communal bonds can be. How easily they can be weaponized by those who view connection as a means of control rather than collaboration. The HOA, originally conceived as a structure to maintain community standards, had been transformed into a vehicle for corporate interests and personal power trips, all while the very resource we depend on for survival was being systematically exploited. I've had many people ask if I regret not revealing my position earlier, if I could have spared myself and my neighbors months of harassment by simply presenting my business card at the first sign of conflict. Perhaps. But I've come to believe that the journey itself held value, not just in the catharsis of its resolution, but in the way it forced me to reconcile the artificial separation I'd created between my professional expertise and my responsibility as a community member. The drought continues, as droughts in our region inevitably do. Water remains a precious commodity, its conservation a daily practice rather than a singular achievement. But something fundamental has shifted in lakeside estates, a reawakening of mutual accountability, a recognition that true community resilience comes not from rigid enforcement of rules, but from the collective wisdom that emerges when we honor both individual rights and shared responsibilities. As for me, I no longer hide my professional identity from my neighbors. The barriers I once maintained between work and home have dissolved, replaced by a more integrated understanding of my purpose. There's a certain liberation in this authenticity, in allowing the knowledge I've spent a career developing to directly benefit those closest to me. And yes, I still collect the rainwater that falls on my roof, each drop a small victory against scarcity, each full barrel a quiet testament to the power of standing firm when what matters most is threatened. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson Patricia inadvertently taught us all, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to comply with unreasonable demands, especially when they come wrapped in the false authority of those who have forgotten what community truly means.